these conventional sources of energy and moving towards cleaner and renewable sources of energy. And for technologies, they now have, an increased role to play in addressing this challenge. And so we see that the present technologies, which are designed to address climate change, offer solutions to the problems created by the previous technologies. So we're in what you could say is a renewable age, where we are moving towards cleaner energy options. And we have different kinds of technologies that have been deployed, such as electric vehicles and some other technologies, which we'll still discuss here, maybe on renewable energy. So we see this movement from the past where where technologies contributed to the problem, to the present where technologies offer solutions to the problem. And so what we would say is that the future depends on today's technological choices. If the world continues on its current pathway, relying on conventional sources of energy, which power certain technologies, then the goals or objectives of the Paris Agreement to reduce global temperature are unlikely to be met. So we have this situation where if we move towards cleaner sources of energy and we base our choices on cleaner technological choices, that could influence our technological future and lead us towards the goal of this seminar, which is sustainable energy access. Now, talking about technologies for climate action, primarily we have mitigation and adaptation technologies. So the mitigation technologies are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where you may have certain technology types like solar PV or wind turbines, which reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So instead of using the fossil-based sources, relying on these cleaner sources reduces emissions. And then we have the adaptation technologies because climate change is somewhat inevitable and there are some effects that will be felt. So there are certain technologies that are designed strictly for adapting to the consequences of climate change. But our focus would be on mitigation technologies. And that's primarily because of our focus on sustainable energy access. And so if we are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, then we will be aware that SDG 7 deals with sustainable energy access and looks to provide affordable and modern energy to all people. And so part of the goals of SDG 7 include tripling global renewable energy capacity, and doubling global average annual efficiency. And these are measures which are targeted towards 2030 to achieve Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And just like I had mentioned earlier, different types of technologies, clean, low carbon, and there may be different terms that may be used to describe them, maybe sustainable or clean or green, but while there are overlaps, they more or less drive at the same thing, which is towards a sustainable energy future. Now let's talk about progress and promise. Oh, are we still following the conversation? Maybe a few thumbs up just to be sure. Oh yeah, absolutely perfect. Thank you. Oh, I asked for a few, but this is quite encouraging. So we have progress and promise. What progress are we making? And what's the promise for the future? So looking at renewable technologies, there is increasing availability of these technology types. Globally, renewable power capacity is projected to increase to almost 4,600 gigawatts between 2025 and 2030. So we see that there is that increased use of renewable sources compared to, say, 50 years ago. And that is good news. We also have declining costs. So one of the key challenges that had impacted renewable energy in the early days was the fact that costs of these technologies were quite prohibitive. And so it made it more difficult for people to adopt them. But when we look at the statistics, we see that a lot of technologies have actually reduced in cost. So costs for solar and batteries have reduced significantly. We have here that total installed costs for renewable power decreased by more than 10% for all technologies between 2023 and 2024. And that is still just more recent data. The fall has been significant, perhaps over 90% or so over so many years. And so the combination of increasing availability and declining costs has led to expanded deployment of these technology types for addressing climate change slash facilitating an energy transition. So we see more of these technology types. We may see more solar panels on rooftops. We may see more wind turbines spread across different parts of the world. But the question still remains, and which brings us to why we are even having this conversation. Is this progress universal? Is this progress universal? And that's part of what we hope to unpack in our conversation today. And to perhaps answer the question more directly, distribution still remains unequal. So the progress is not as we would have hoped, despite the positive information we've just heard. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, around 600 million people do not have access to electricity. And we must also consider that the population, Africa has a growing population, and the numbers are likely to increase, so that even if maybe 10 million people are connected, 20 new individuals could be born. And so we have this situation where the distribution of these technologies for facilitating the energy transition may not meet up the pace of the growing population. And in all this, it's also against the backdrop of Africa having significant renewable potential. So Africa has 60% of the world's best solar resources, which you would expect would translate to, solar being the primary source of energy. But what we see, a saddening contrast, is that in terms of global energy investment, only 3% goes to sub-Saharan Africa. And so we see these gaps are existing, and we have to ask ourselves another question, which is, why does this gap, or why do these gaps persist? Now, our conversation today primarily should be around the idea of technology justice. But I felt that it would be good for us in shaping our understanding of technology justice to start with understanding what technology injustice looks like. And regarding technology injustice, we would say that this arises from in two different circumstances. One is based on lack of access, to these technologies, and remember, we are focusing on the renewable/clean energy technology types. So we have the lack of access to these kinds of technologies, and also the issue of what happens when or after these technologies have been deployed, the injustices that may arise in those circumstances. And the technology injustices may arise not just at one point, but at different points across the technology life cycle of a particular technology type. And so it's important for us to start our conversation understanding what technology injustices actually are. Before we continue, I would like us to consider a scenario or a number of scenarios just to see if we can identify whether they reflect what we would understand to be technology justice or perhaps technology injustice. And so our first scenario talks about a developing country that has been consistently making calls for technology transfer, but is receiving or has received little support from the international community. Then we also look at a situation where a country has maybe entered into an agreement for the supply of certain climate technologies, but is unable to afford the high patent or licensing costs for these renewable technologies. Um, we look at a third situation where a worker cannot afford solar despite availability. So we have said that, or maybe I may not have pressed on this, which is that a lot of these technologies are actually largely available. They are because we do see them, so we know they are available. But a question is, are they being deployed at the pace and to the locations and to the people where that most need them? And so we have a worker who can't afford, and I imagine a scenario where a person is earning a monthly salary, say in a Nigerian context of, and this is not a quote. This is just for illustration purposes. So earning 70,000 naira monthly, but the costs for the installing solar PV for their residents would cost 3.5 million. Would this represent an instance of technology injustice? And then finally, we look at a firm who maybe has received certain technologies, but cannot maintain these technologies or replicate them. So I think I would just like to see, maybe drop some comments in the chat on your thoughts about this, of whether these represent, from before, we run through this class, do these represent technology injustices to you? Is there anyone that you feel doesn't qualify? I just want to, get a sense of what people are thinking. And then also, maybe if you feel that these are, without question, you can also, reflect that through your reactions so that we know that we're having, so maybe, I don't know if they have a thumbs down, but yeah, let's just have a sense of what we think. So please drop some comments in the chat. I may not be able to see the chat now, but probably look at those later. So technology injustices, like I had said, they arise at two stages. They arise before deployment and after deployment. And these technology injustices at the international level are worsened by structural gaps in the design and operation of the international climate regime. Just to backtrack a little bit, if you're dropping a comment, it would be helpful to just say why you think it is a technology injustice, just to have a sense of, what people understand about this. So yes, the technology injustices, and we're focusing on the international level because our focus is on, technology justice and climate law. And taking it to the domestic level would involve, a huge array of different, legislation, etc. Interestingly, in most countries, technology is not quite as prioritized as it should be, but that could be a discussion for another time. So these technology injustices are exacerbated by structural gaps in the design and operation of the international climate regime. And that's partly what I will speak to today. That's partly what I'll speak to today in terms of the structural gaps that exist in the design and operation of the international climate regime. And I would want us to consider three areas where that reflect injustices. Three areas. So the first, we have access, then affordability and capability injustices. I mean, okay. All right. Okay. So let's start with access injustices. We have unequal access, as we have already established, despite the widespread availability of these different technology types. And I want us to look at it from a legal perspective, just to understand where, these structural gaps that appear to, work against the achievement of, say, SDG 7 or promoting sustainable energy access. So when we look at the climate regime, particularly the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, when we look at Article 4.5, so Article 4 basically provides for the obligations of different parties. So in some parties, obligations on all parties, and in other parties, obligations on specific parties. So when we look at Article 4 sub 5 of the UNFCCC, what we find is that there is an obligation placed on developed countries to take all practicable steps to promote, facilitate, finance the transfer or access to technologies. So you see environmentally sound technologies, which encompasses or includes the types of technology that we're discussing here today. But the key word there is access. So these countries have this obligation to take all practicable steps to promote, facilitate, and finance access to the relevant technology types that we are discussing here. But of course, when we have to have it in mind that the UNFCCC is more of a framework convention, and so it allows for the establishment of protocols and agreements that may contain more legally binding or clear obligations. And so that's what was done under the Paris Agreement, where we have Article 10, which deals with technology development and transfer. And we could say it's a way to institutionalize the idea under Article 4.5 of the UNFCCC. Now, when we look at this, what gaps can we now identify, perhaps in the nature of the obligations? So we see that the obligations are weakly specified because, yes, it has said in broad terms, what the kinds of technologies, but we don't have any quantified targets. We don't know what would, how can we say that our goal or objective has been achieved? So if, for example, let's say we need 10,000 gigawatts of renewable, let's say solar PV, if a country provides only 10 gigawatts, how can we say that they have not met their obligation when there is no clear targets for them to achieve? There is also no clear time, or there are also no clear timelines under the international climate regime, the UNFCCC. So the SDG is a different thing, but as the achieving SDG can be facilitated through the climate regime. So there are no clear timelines, and so that raises questions. If it is not clear what the targets are, and it's not clear what the timelines are, then are we just going to continue on this pathway, without any clear targets we need to achieve? So that's something that we need to look into. Also, in terms of ambiguity in the way that responsibility is allocated within these agreements. So if we look at Article 10, subsection 6 of or sub-article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it states that support shall be provided to developing countries to help them to meet the objectives of Article 10, which, as I've said, relates to technology development and transfer. It says that support shall be provided, but it doesn't state who shall provide the support. So it's written in kind of a passive sense. So it's one thing to say developed countries shall provide, and it's another thing to say support shall be provided without necessarily saying who will provide the support. And so we now see that kind of disconnect between the way it was expressed quite clearly under the UNFCCC, and then the way that responsibility is somewhat diffuse under Article 10 of the Paris Agreement, which could even raise questions as to whether that obligation of technology development and transfer exists in a very strong fashion, and perhaps could be one of the reasons that exacerbates the technology injustices that we see. We also have the global stocktake, which is the way that the Paris Agreement keeps stock of progress towards addressing climate change. And this global stocktake looks at what all countries have done and assesses them collectively rather than individually. So if, say, country A has contributed maybe a significant proportion. So let's say out of 100%, country A has done 60%, country B has done 2%, and country C has done 5%, but the goal has not been reached. There would be no mention that, country A has done quite well and country B and C need to do more, because the assessment is collective. So it would be that all the countries have not done well or need to do more. And so there is no individual accountability, which is a way that could prompt countries to take more specific action. And then we look in terms of reporting without enforceability. So under the transparency mechanism in the Paris Agreement, that is Article 13. Article 13 states that all developed countries, places a requirement on developed countries to provide information on the technology transfer support that they have provided to developing countries. So that is, a clear obligation placed on developed countries. It also asks developing countries to provide information on the technology transfer support received. So we see that there is, something that seems like clear obligations, but the obligation to provide information is not an obligation to transfer technology. The obligation to provide information is just to say this is what we are willing to, or what we have done, rather than this is what, is going to help us to achieve the goal the way it should be. And so there is reporting, but it lacks that enforceability, where you cannot even measure when a country has done well or if it is still lagging quite behind. And just before continuing, I wanted to say that part of the reason why I'm speaking along these lines is that it's important for us to, in understanding the structural gaps, to look at the existing regime to see where some of these gaps exist that prevent technologies from being transferred the way they should be. So that's us for now on the issue of access injustices. Can we get some reactions if we're together, and if I can go ahead? Okay, thank you. It's always hard because you're not sure if you're speaking because I can only see myself. So it's good to know that everyone is listening as well. Thank you so much. So now, technologies, we're looking at affordability injustices. Technologies, despite being available, remain financially inaccessible. And I know I had said earlier that a lot of people have or the prices or the costs of technologies have dropped, but that doesn't mean that they are not prohibitive, the upfront costs. So if you remember from our earlier scenario where I talked about a person earning 70,000 naira and having to buy or pay for the cost of solar PV, which would be 3.5 million naira. And those costs I don't have the specific details on what the current costs are, but I think they are reflective. And if you have that kind of situation, I didn't do the math, but I wanted to know how long it would take such a person to raise the funds needed to pay for that based on the salary. I'm sure it would be a really long time to do that. So we see that the costs are still inaccessible. And why this is also important is because in the countries where this challenge remains, so where we have the 600 million energy access deficits, there are greater priorities in terms of, say, economic growth and addressing issues of poverty. And so energy doesn't seem like the highest thing on the priority list. And especially when you now have a country that may have cheaper fossil fuel sources, they may prefer to rely on those instead. So the upfront costs are still high, and there's limited financing for low-income communities who may want to, engage in these projects. And sometimes the enabling legal framework is already in place in these countries that allows them to set up, say, mini grids for their communities. But without adequate financing, they may be unable to do this. Then, of course, we have the significant investment gaps. Like I mentioned, 3% just going to Africa, despite the high level of renewable potential that Africa has. 60%, that's more than half of the global total, but lagging seriously behind in terms of investment opportunity. So the investment gaps remain closed. Now, to tie it into, to the law or to international law, we go back to the UNFCCC, looking at Article 4.3, which says that developing countries shall also provide such financial resources, including for technology transfer, which will be needed by developing countries to meet agreed full incremental costs. So we see that there is a clear link between the obligation of finance under the international climate regime and the provision of technology transfer. So both go or should go hand in hand. We also see in Article 11 of the UNFCCC, which establishes the financial mechanism, and that's where we have the Global Environment Fund and the Green Climate Fund that are part of the financial mechanism. So we see that there is clear institutionalization of the obligation of finance, and this has been further strengthened with Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, which places a clear obligation on developed countries to provide financial support to developing countries to meet their continuing obligations under the convention, under the UNFCCC. Now, let's look at the gaps that could exist. So first of all, we have the financing is inadequate and sometimes uneven. At Copenhagen, they had agreed to 100 billion per year, which it took several years before they were able to achieve $100 billion per year. And that's just in terms of climate finance. Now it's moving up to 300 billion. It's moving up to 300 billion, and under the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG. But that is still insufficient to address the climate challenge. It's still insufficient, and we are yet to see whether we will be able to achieve this objective. So that's one of the challenges that we face. And remember, I've said that finance and technology are intrinsically linked when we look at Article 4.3 of the UNFCCC. Interestingly, even Article 4.5, 4 sub 5 that I mentioned earlier under access injustices, it also alludes to the need for finance for technology transfer. So we see that there's that strong connection between them. So that's one of the issues, the quantity of finance. The second is the quality of finance. So most of the finance that is being received is as loans rather than as grants. And so you could have 100% financing with only 3% being grant-based and the rest being based on loans, which means that for a country that is struggling to meet up with its own economic growth, they would be placed into further debt just to try to meet up with the demands of climate change and facilitating an energy transition. And so the quality or the type of financing represents a kind of injustice that we see, where the countries that most need the technologies are being placed into further, and who did not cause the problem, because we have Africa with about maybe 4% of emissions, that in terms of climate change. So Africa hasn't caused the problem, but faces the most problem, and then is now receiving loans instead of grants. And so that further worsens the situation and makes it more difficult for these countries to transition and secure sustainable energy access. We also see that there are weak linkages between technology and finance within the international climate regime. So remember, I said that technology and finance are connected to each other. We've seen that in Article 4.3 and Article 4.5 of the UNFCCC. But the two mechanisms that have been established under the climate regime, that's the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism, are not clearly connected to each other. And so what it means is that while the financial mechanism may receive funds based on clearly defined replenishment cycles, the technology mechanism would receive funds based on voluntary funding. And so that represents a significant gap where one mechanism is receiving consistent funding, while the other is based on, would I say, goodwill or the contributions of on a voluntary level. So that weak linkage impacts the goal of sustainable energy access, because the technology mechanism is made up of two organizations. We have the Technology Executive Committee and the Climate Technology Center and Network. The Climate Technology Center and Network is where a lot of developing countries make requests for support in one way or the other. But because it receives only voluntary funding, it is unable or largely unable to meet up with this high demand from countries, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa. We also see that there is no clear inclusion of licensing costs or, say, patent costs. And we will talk a bit more about IPRs and the role that they may play in this whole conversation. So remember, I talked about agreed full incremental costs being covered, and that's where these IPR costs could be included, but there hasn't been that agreement. And so we see a situation where discussions around IPR, intellectual property rights, are consistently left outside of the international climate regime. And then finally, in terms of affordability, we see that there is no dedicated funding window for technologies. So under the Green Climate Fund, for example, while it recognizes the important role for technology, it hasn't yet created that dedicated funding window specific to technology, and so focuses its efforts more on mitigation and adaptation. And so if technology is embedded within finance, then there should be that clear link and clear flow of funding from the GCF to the relevant technology bodies. We'll now look at capability injustices. So if you remember at the beginning, I'd said that technology injustices arise before deployment and after deployment. So we've looked at access and affordability. These kind of occur before deployment, but for capability injustices, they may arise after deployment. So for example, you have the technology has been received by a firm in a developing country, but they are unable or have limited ability to use these technologies to maintain them or to adapt them for their own purposes. And so we still see some legal justification for this. When we look at the UNFCCC, still Article 4.5, which speaks to endogenous capacities. And Article 4.5 says that developed country parties shall support the development and enhancement of endogenous capacities and technologies of developing country parties. And it's important for us to realize or see that for all the different provisions that I have mentioned under the UNFCCC, they are couched in kind of a mandatory sense, but perhaps the nature of the agreement itself prevents it from being strictly mandatory. And so when we now see the conversations that happen between different countries, we see that the developing countries are always calling for and requesting that developed countries should fulfill their obligations under Article 4. But for developed countries, they do not see these obligations as legally binding, and that further worsens the injustices that we see in this space. In terms of capability gaps, there is weak capacity building. So just to state that there are means of implementation under the international climate regime. We have finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. And these are basically measures that were introduced as a means to support developing countries to achieve their objectives. but they have not been implemented the way that they should. And so where there is weak capacity building or limited knowledge transfer, it becomes more difficult for firms and the countries themselves that have these energy access deficits to be able to, use or adapt or replicate the technologies to suit their local circumstances. And that also brings us to the constraints related to intellectual property rights, with countries facing different constraints when attempting to replicate technologies. And so where you have the inability to replicate, capacity building is weak, and the knowledge transfer has not been done, then it becomes harder for these countries to move towards sustainable energy access. We also have weak domestic innovation systems in a lot of these countries, and that also makes it harder for these countries to move towards sustainable energy access. Are we understanding so far? Okay, great. So we've just looked at three different injustices, and I would say that for this presentation, it's not a deeply theoretical presentation on the injustices. It's just for us to understand and have a clear picture of what you know these technology injustices could be, and then that would lead us to knowing what technology justice can be. Because if we are able to know what the technology injustices are, then we have a clearer pathway on where the technology justice should be introduced and should be implemented. I thought it would be necessary to consider some cross-cutting issues, particularly IPR. So, and just in line with what I have been doing so far, which is to tie our conversation to existing international agreements, particularly within the climate regime. But for this one, I would go to the TRIPS agreement, Article 66, sub 2, and that provision places an obligation on developed countries to provide incentives to enterprises and institutions within their territories for the purpose of promoting and encouraging technology transfer to least developed country members. And this is to enable them to create a sound and viable technological base. So we see that developed countries are to sent in countries for the purpose of facilitating to LDCs and other countries. Now, in terms of the issues with this, there's weak implementation of Article 662. While there is an obligation for developed countries to provide reports on, detailing what they have done to implement these obligations, the reports tend to lack detail on the incentives provided or the technologies transferred. Additionally, there is no strong enforcement mechanism because the TRIPS Council does not have an enforcement mandate to ensure that developed countries meet up with these obligations. So while we may say that, okay, the TRIPS agreement is unconnected to the international climate regime, it's good to see how this issue can still impact or affect sustainable energy access. Because if the developed countries provide incentives to enterprises and institutions within their own territories, that would help to facilitate sustainable energy access in other countries. Some additional structural issues as well, which I'll just touch on briefly. So there is a conversation around enabling environments. And so what is usually said is that all countries should ensure that they have the right enabling environment for technology transfer to thrive. So we have that situation where the focus tends to be more on the enabling environment for the technology recipient countries, which would typically be the developing countries. And so for enabling environment, we have to look at both the technology supplier country and technology recipient country and see that they have put the measures in place. But where the burden is placed on developed countries, then it becomes more difficult. And it was under the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of the protocol or the predecessor to the Paris Agreement, and is one of the protocols or agreements that came under the UNFCCC. So that was where the conversation on enabling environments was introduced and calling for the enabling environments to be ensured. And even then, it was clear that developed countries had more of an obligation to achieve this. But what we saw, or what we've seen, is that there was a shift. So initially, under the Kyoto Protocol, we had the technology transfer framework that placed that responsibility on developed countries to provide technology or to support enabling environments in developing countries. But that responsibility has been subtly shifted to the technology framework, which was established under the Paris Agreement. And it is now the technology framework that is responsible for the creation of enabling environments. And so that could also impact, or affect our drive towards sustainable energy access, where you have and developed countries could provide additional support for provide additional support for enabling environments, but have not necessarily done so. Another structural issue to just look at is in terms of NDCs. So NDCs stand for the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and that is the core aspect of the Paris Agreement, where countries state in their NDCs what measures they will take, and they constantly and continuously increase or improve their ambition under these NDCs. And they've submitted NDCs since, early days from 2015 or thereabout. And now we're seeing new NDCs. I think the last set were submitted maybe by September last year. For most countries, especially the developing countries, they clearly state that they have technology needs. They need, they will state what they need at varying levels of detail and say, this is what we need. But we see that for more of the developed countries, they rarely specify the support that they intend to provide in advance, if at all. They may not say that, okay, we will provide this kind of support, or we would finance, specific projects. And when we see, in some of the different reports where, support has been provided, it is unclear that this was as a result of maybe earlier commitments. So it could just be something that happened based on investment and not necessarily specific to a commitment being made by the country. And when we look at Article 3 of the Paris Agreement, it says that it calls on parties to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts as defined in Articles 4, 7, 9, 10, 11. Now, Articles 9, 10, 11 are the ones that deal with the means of implementation. So that is finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. And if we are to take this provision on the face of it, it suggests that these countries, every country, should state the efforts that they are making in terms of finance, technology transfer, or capacity building. But countries don't usually do this. So because of the phrase, all parties are to undertake, it is not considered as binding or mandatory. And so it's typically ignored. And most countries would rather just ignore that and not say anything about the efforts that they will take to support technology or finance under their NDCs. So let's now move. We're getting to the end of our session, and I hope everybody has been able to pick one or two things. So we look at the technology implementation program. So that's a recent development which was introduced at at the Conference of Parties, COP30, recently in Belém, I think in Brazil. And so this TIP signals a shift towards implementation, because what we have seen over time when it comes to technology is that there hasn't been that strong move towards implementation. And most of what we see is what I describe as, say, motion without movement. So we see a lot of activity and a lot of hyperactivity, but not necessarily movement in the directions that we would like to see it. But this represents some form of promise, since its core mandate is to implement technologies. However, there are some risks. Part of this is that it copies some of the different challenges that we've seen from our conversation so far. And so it relies on voluntary funding, which means that there is no guarantee that we would have or receive the amount of funds that are needed to facilitate implementation. Then, of course, intellectual property rights issues are still excluded. And that means if any of these issues should arise, then they would operate as stumbling blocks. And of course, also the enabling environment tension. So when this program is implemented, will there still be conversations around that place the pressure on certain countries to create these enabling environments, which they would need support to do so, but which the support has effectively been transferred from the developed countries themselves to the to the technology framework. So these are some of the risks, that there is going to just be that continuation of what we have seen so far, and that may impact the ability of the TIP to achieve its own objectives. I think before I continue, I would just like to look and see whether there have been any comments. Let's see.
Yes,
Okay,
there are some comments and questions. So maybe when you're done,
okay, when I'm
we
done.
can
Okay,
go through
okay.
the list.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you, Dr. Evie, for that. Okay, so, well, we can continue because I still have another scenario that I would want us to look into based on what we have heard so far. So remember, we've talked about different kinds of injustices. And like I said, these are not, technical terms, but just to help aid understanding. So we know that there are access injustices and affordability, capability injustices. And I want us to look at what, if we can see the screen, it says a developing country identifies solar mini grids as a priority in its nationally determined contribution and technology needs assessment. And it calls on us to identify which of the following reflects technology injustices. And so we have 6 options there. And I would just encourage everyone to, put in our responses. I'll give, some time for people to be able to put their responses, maybe just the number that you feel those ones represent technology injustices. Yeah, I can see some answers coming in. Someone has asked if they could get the slides. I think that's something that Dr. Evie can speak to. Dr. Evie?
Yes, we will share the slides to the attendees.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much. I'll just give maybe a minute more. Okay, someone can't see my screen. Okay, I don't know why that would be. There are people who are responding. So remember the question. The question says, which of the following reflects technology injustices? And perhaps if you could just also add why you think so, why you think that this represents a technology injustice. You don't have to elaborate on all the answers. You could just speak to one of them or the other. So we have a range of thoughts or ideas on, why we feel a particular situation represents a technology injustice. And this exercise is important because I would want us that at the end of this session, we should be able to look at the conversations around technology differently. So it is not for us to it's for us to be able to identify and see that there are technology injustices which exacerbate or worsen the ability of certain, parts of the world or countries to achieve sustainable energy access, which is the purpose of our conversation today. And the whole idea behind the structural, looking at the laws underlying it is to see that there are legal and institutional mechanisms in place which ordinarily should facilitate, but sometimes act as a limitation or barrier to effectively pursuing these objectives. Okay, I've seen quite a few comments, and we'll speak more to this after this session. So I think if it is okay for us, can we have some thumbs up and then I can continue to the next slide? We're almost at the end. Okay, I'm seeing a good number of them. Thank you very much. So I'm moving on now. Yes. So now that we have discussed, some of these injustices, let's now look to the pathways. What are the pathways that could lead us to technology justice? Because if we do not understand what is technology injustice, how then do we know what technology justice should look like? And so we start by just considering, we've looked at obligations and seen that there are issues around some of these obligations which not necessarily being clear. And so if we are to move towards technology justice within the context of climate law, there should be more clarity. For example, what support should be provided and who is responsible for providing it? These are things that should be clear. Also, we could also improve how obligations are being tracked and assessed. We could improve that because remember we talked about the transparency mechanism, which yes, countries state the support they will provide or the support that they will receive, but there is no mention on the quantity or what exactly is needed. So that is one area of improvement. And we should also have it in mind when it comes to issues around justice, why justice is always a conversation to be had is that justice is not always institutionalized within existing legal frameworks. And so we have to push for justice and for it to become operationalized and institutionalized within a particular legal regime. The second point would be the need for us to align finance with technology. So what we have seen earlier, we've looked at how there is that poor linkage between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism. And so with clearer finance connection, and just to say that this is not impossible because if we look at a totally different agreement, the Montreal Protocol on ozone layer depletion. The Montreal Protocol had a strong connection between finance and technology transfer. And that protocol was able to fund, say, the cost of patents and licenses. And that kind of model could help us move in the direction that we need to go. So these are not impossibilities that have never happened at the international level. What we are saying is that the way that the international climate regime is currently structured may act as a hindrance to achieving technology justice. So we need to align finance with technology transfer. And for example, countries in their NDCs have identified their technology needs and said, okay, this is what we need. It would be great to see other countries stating that they would provide support to meet those needs. So we need clearer matching of what one country would do, or what one country is requesting with what another country would do. So that if we say, okay, we have, let's say in Ghana, we have quantified how much we need to, maybe in our technology needs assessment, and we say we need $50 million to achieve a particular objective. It would be good to see another country stepping in to say they would contribute to that $50 million. And so that matching could help us to move in the direction we wish to go. And of course, improving coordination between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism so that we don't have a situation where the technology mechanism is being funded voluntarily while the financial mechanism is being funded based on replenishment cycles. I don't have the full figures, but the support received by the financial mechanism sometimes runs into billions, while the support received by the technology mechanism may be in the maybe 100 million or thereabout category. So the gap is significant. And when I say billions, I'm not 10 billion, like much more than that. So the gap is significant. And considering, if we remember from the initial slide, the role that technologies play and how important they are, then it's important for us to look at this issue and address it head on by connecting both mechanisms. We also talk about, okay, yes, increasing visibility of finance directed towards technology deployment. So that's still in line with what I'd said earlier. It should be clear because sometimes there is a sense in which finance swallows up the idea of technology deployment, and it would be good to have a situation where it is clear that this finance is going to be used for the purpose of this technology deployment or at any other stage in the technology life cycle. Still on pathways to technology justice, we look at addressing the cost barriers, including those that are related to IPRs. And so if we recognize that licensing and patent costs are part of the technology development and transfer process, then that would, and that is possible within the context of the UNFCCC, even though it hasn't been done yet. But that would place countries in a stronger position when they have issues around IPR and they are able to pay for these costs for certain technologies. Additionally, ensuring that these costs can be covered through for climate finance. If you remember, I mentioned Article 4.3, which talked about agreed full incremental costs. And those costs could, that relates to the obligation of finance. And those costs, if agreed upon, could include these licensing costs. And of course, exploring mechanisms that reduce cost barriers while maintaining incentives for innovation. So part of the challenge sometimes, especially when conversations around IPR emerge, is that people, the firms that make these technologies are always concerned, that maybe they would lose their competitive edge. And so the mechanisms that should be explored should reduce the cost barriers faced by firms in developing countries, but also maintaining incentives for innovation. Okay. So I think this is our penultimate or last slide. Pathways to technology justice, strengthening endogenous capacity. So there is a need to invest in local innovation systems in these countries, increasing or improving skills development, as well as promoting institutional capacity. Because when this is done, and remember, there is that obligation under Article 4 sub 5 of the UNFCCC. When this is done effectively, this can help these countries um, to be able to make progress on their own without that support. So if a country is able to take a particular technology, they study it and they're able to redesign it or refine it or replicate it to suit their local circumstances, that would put many countries in a position to facilitate sustainable energy access on their own terms. And then lastly, just looking at the technology implementation program that I mentioned earlier, it can be used as a tool, but that would only be if the existing patterns are ignored. So the existing pattern allows the focus to be on technology importation. But if they can move this conversation from importation to co-development, where you have local actors involved and where domestic priorities are reflected, then this could better place many local actors and their firms or these countries in a position where they can champion the cause of technology justice. And so just to round up everything that I have been saying so far, and thank you all so much for being here and listening. Um, Understanding technology justice is, in our own very simplistic sense, is to understand technology injustices. And when we know what qualifies as a technology injustice, it becomes easier for us to identify where the changes should happen. And so I believe that from this session, if there is anything we have gained, it should be that we have an increased ability to identify where the injustices lie and to know that there is a legal regime in place at the international level which could facilitate or act as a barrier, and then we would know where to channel our efforts as we move closer towards technology and justice. So I think that brings me to the end of my session. Thank you all so very much. Dr. Evie, you can give me some guidance on,
Thank you
what to
so
do with
much.
those questions now.
So I have sort of helped you out. So while you were speaking, I was sort of organizing the questions because I know they are mixed with comments and the scenario exercises. So for efficiency, I put them, I structured it so I can read it one after the other, and then
Okay.
you can go ahead. So from the chat, I think there are about 2 questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so it's easy to pull it out. From the chat, the first one from Moses Oga says, why is climate finance? So I'll read his two because they're sort of interrelated. Why is climate finance policy unfavorable to developing countries? And then he says, climate finance is a major challenge in Nigeria. Without access to sustainable energy technology, becomes useless. So what are the restorative justice solutions to climate finance? So he's
Okay.
saying without access to sustainable energy technology, it becomes useless. What restorative justice solutions can be put in place to ensure there's sufficient finance? Because like you said, there's a link between um, finance and technology, which is very true. I mean, the technology has to be financed from somewhere. So his question borders around climate finance being unfavorable to developing countries and what restorative justice solutions can be put in place to address the challenge.
Okay. Just before I continue, are you looking at you said the Q&A? Do I have access to the Q&A? So I
I
can.
believe you do. I was looking at the chat, but let me paste. Let me just,
Okay, okay, yeah, I think I can see it now.
yes,
Okay,
then,
I want to have access to the questions too.
okay,
Okay, so
let me paste it to you. You can go on. I'll just,
okay, yeah, so I think the first part is why it doesn't favor, why it's unfavorable, why is climate finance unfavorable to developing countries.
yes.
Okay, yeah. So Um, that's a question that I feel maybe developed countries could answer better as to why they are being unfavorable. But I think fundamentally, a lot of developed countries, they do not wish to have additional financial obligations. So they have many different agreements that they are parts of. And when they participate in these different agreements, there is pressure on them to always provide financial support. And so it becomes a difficult task where in every agreement they say you are supposed to provide finance. Now, if knowing that most of these countries, yes, they are developed and yes, they may have caused or contributed to the problem, but they get their funding from taxpayers within their countries, and taxpayers do ask questions. And so they need to be able to justify why they are spending, huge amounts of money on, say, climate change, which is an issue that some of them may not even understand or may not experience at all. So for some countries, even climate change may be better for their own countries. So let's say a country that has, ice formations over land. And if the ice should melt, that would be fresh agricultural land that has never been used, which could increase crop yield. So they may not understand why is our country using our taxpayer funds to fund climate change that does not necessarily affect or impact us. And so that's one aspect of it, why to they are not really keen to support developing countries. They have too many commitments and they don't want to increase their commitments. So yeah, that's one way to look at it. And then on the issue of restorative justice, I think you maybe perhaps you want to understand why how we can put things right. Maybe let me put it that way. How we can put things right or put things in the right place. Nigeria, like you mentioned, has struggles with accessing climate finance, and maybe that's part of the problem because we talked about the quality of the funds that are received. You have the grant based and the loan based. So for a country like Nigeria, they would be looking for funds that aren't loan based, but the likelihood is that they will get those are the kinds of funds that they would receive. And so it's not a question of are we taking more loans? And if we're looking at it from that justice lens, is it really justice for a country to take up that is trying to meet up with its own commitments to take up more loans to solve a problem that it did not necessarily cause? So I think those are just some of the issues that we need to think around when we talk about climate finance in terms of whether it is fair, whether it is something that, and these countries should be forced to or required to resolve. I don't know if that touches on your question. But yes, that would be my perspective.
Thank you very much. I believe that addresses that question. So I'll just ask, this question is towards the end, but it sort of links to what you have alluded to. So it says, who do you think is responsible for sustainable energy financing for developing countries? This is from Winnie. She thinks this question can settle the matter of energy poverty, which is integral to development. So who is responsible for sustainable energy financing for developing countries? That's the question. Just even looking at it, it's like for me, just my own personal
Yeah.
opinion. It's like asking who is responsible for your child. I mean, I believe that we have to sort of move to the phase where we're now taking responsibility for ourselves because um, we have the capacity, although we need some form of support, maybe from in terms of technology transfer. But in terms of the capacity, I believe we have that capacity locally and with the right framework in place because honestly, I don't think the international framework is particularly, there are no binding obligations on developed countries. So I don't think it's particularly favorable to developing countries. But I think even locally within our own context, we can find solutions that can help us move forward on this issue of sustainable energy financing. I mean, there are so many avenues, like you even mentioned in your, when you were talking about the affordability gap. Um, Domestic innovation systems need to be put in place. There are so many avenues where we can carve out our own pathway to address our challenges. So for me, I would say the responsibility for developing countries starts with us, actually, because we understand our context better, we understand our needs better, although we need some form of support in terms of technology transfer. But I'm a bit concerned that there's some form of reluctance to allow developing countries get a full grasp in this area, given the benefits that developed countries are also gaining from the gap, because the gap is where the opportunities lie. So my question will be, knowing that we're responsible for this, and just moving on Winnie's question, how do we then move forward to take responsibility for our sustainable energy financing needs in order to ensure that we meet our targets?
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Evie. It's a great question, speaking about sustainable energy financing, and I would agree with you, in terms of, having our own responsibility. So I know that my presentation has focused largely on, developed country responsibilities. And that's only because that's where we find, some sort of, legal backing for that. And then additionally, there are those mechanisms that have been put in place internationally. The means of implementation, finance, technology, capacity, those are just ways to support developing countries, but it doesn't take away the responsibility from developing countries. And so when it comes to addressing global challenges, even developing countries cannot sit back, relax, and wait for all the funds to come from external sources. They have their own part to play. And so it would be a situation where everyone would contribute to the extent that they are able to contribute. So for us, in developing countries, taking responsibility would mean making our contributions to the extent we are able to. Because, if we look at it from, say, a solidarity perspective, what it means is that solidarity doesn't place a one-sided obligation where only one set of countries provides support and then the other set of countries doesn't do anything. Solidarity requires both sets of countries to have a mutual obligations. So they are not necessarily equal, but they should be doing something. And so if we and we see evidence of this in the NDCs. So under the nationally determined contributions, most countries include what they call their unconditional contributions and their conditional contributions. So the unconditional contributions are those that the country says we will do this by ourselves. And then the conditional contributions are those they say we cannot do this without international support. And so when you have that balance between the two things, then of course, these countries have committed to doing this on their own, and we should hold them to account to, pursue whatever objectives they need to pursue to ensure sustainable energy access, but also recognizing that their best efforts may not be enough and they need that international support. So, of course, there are different measures that can be taken, perhaps countries being able to create the right environments for investors to come in and support projects that are related to sustainable energy. That's just one out of a number of things that can be done. But I would say that we definitely have our own responsibility, and other countries too, developed countries should also play their own part so that with the combination from both sides, we are able to achieve the goal of sustainable energy access.
Okay, thank you so much for that position. I'll read through some more questions, and then we have a bit of time. So you're now on the hot seat. So, from Monica, she says, there appears to be an expectation that developed countries will provide support to address technology injustices. Developed countries will do this if it benefits them in some way, which is what I mentioned. What can developing countries do on their own to address technology injustices? So we're saying, I think what she's saying is outside the international framework, outside the obligations of developed countries to assist developing countries on their own, developing countries, what can they do to address technology injustices?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And it still ties into some of what I've already said, which is that both sets of countries have responsibilities. And so definitely we can rely to some extent on developed countries, but it is also even better. If it was possible, we shouldn't even have to rely on them at all. Yeah, because that now suggests some level of dependency, and we can't do things on our own. But for these countries, the question is, okay, what can they do? First of all, we must understand that some of the countries have certain limitations that even despite their best efforts, they may not be able to. So for a country that has financial limitations, how do they go about raising the finances needed? So I think what they can, like I said earlier, what they can do should fall within the realm of what that country can do. Sometimes it may be something as little, not as little, but as significant as passing the right legislation. So they can pass the right legislation which could, provide room for greater access to technology. So maybe they introduce laws that create incentives for foreigners. They create a favorable tax regime. Those are measures that they can take that wouldn't necessarily cost them anything. And so that raises questions too as to whether these countries are doing those things. And the part of the question was that, the developed countries don't do something that doesn't necessarily benefit them, which is the absolute truth. And so for these countries, they have to understand that, okay, the investment, where is it coming from? It's coming from outside. Investors have legitimate expectations. They have what they are expecting when they come to do business in your country. And so if they have any concerns that those legitimate expectations will not be met, then they will not come. Investments flow to where there will be return on investment. That's just a fact. And so making a country a haven for foreign investments generally, and then specific to sustainable energy is what countries can do. And so creating these kinds of environments are not limited to legal issues. Legal is just one aspect of the conversation. There are so many other aspects that need, for example, dispute resolution. How do we resolve disputes? How what are the tax regime I've talked about? There are different things that can be done which are not necessarily legal issues, but the country has its own responsibility to create that right condition for the investors to be attracted. We have I don't know how many developed countries, but say we have over 190 countries around the world, and investors are looking for where to go. Investors are not going to go to a particular place just because you say you have needs. They're going to go there because they know that their resources they are guaranteed to make something out of it. And that's the advantage of, say, Africa. Africa is the frontier for investment. And, within our, the African countries, there's a lot that can be done to encourage investors to want to, put their funds within the continent and help resolve some of these issues. So that would be my take on that. Before I continue, Dr. Evie, just to ask, we can still have the questions, but would we have any time to still just look through the chat, the earlier chat on the
Yes,
responses?
I'm going through. I've done that. I've compiled everything. Don't worry. I'm
Okay, okay,
compiling
okay.
it on the go, so don't worry.
Okay,
The
okay,
questions
okay.
will not be missed unless we run out of time, because we have up until I think 2:30. So I would I will carry on
Okay.
if you are fine with that. So
Yes.
somebody says, in as much as I believe that developing countries should be self-reliant and independent, we also have to address the underlying issue of why do we have climate change now? Africa in particular is responsible for less than 4% of historic emissions that led to climate change, and we are bearing the brunt. And therefore, developed countries should definitely take responsibility for their historic actions. So while I agree with that, because that's now looking at recognition justice, and now
Okay.
saying go and recognize your wrong and restore, like restorative, all tied into one, alongside distributive justice. But we cannot keep going back. We have to somehow also move forward in terms of building our own systems, putting research and development initiatives and centers in place, because we have the capability, as Dr. Mark, even some of it might not be in country, but we do have, even in diaspora, we have the capability. And if we are able to draw on this capability, I believe that we will come up with strategies and innovation and ideas that can allow us fund some of these gaps that are missing in the developing country context. So yes, the developed countries should bear the brunt. They should recognize their wrongs and restore. But how long are we keep going to be pushing that narrative out? I think that narrative gives them the opportunity to also continue or this perceived resistance to technology transfer. If they see, if we are viewed as taking the bull by the horn, I believe that they would also cooperate, and each party will bear their respective responsibilities over time. So, Dr. Mark, I don't know if you have any further before I continue.
Okay. Yeah. For the person asking the question, I understand, Africa hasn't caused the problem, but they are facing the brunt of the challenge. When I was doing my PhD, I was really trying to think and understand these kinds of issues. So I came up with an analogy, which may not work in every circumstance, but I came up with an analogy of saying you have a big brother and you have a younger brother. And, some people may understand the dynamics in that relationship. So it's like when the big brother, if something affects the big brother can easily get the younger brother to, play along. But if something affects the younger brother, the big brother does not necessarily need to follow, or, take it as seriously, because it's his younger brother, something like that. And that may not be a perfect example, but like I said, it was just an analogy I used. And so how do I translate that to this conversation? We haven't caused the problem. We are facing the brunt of it. When the ozone layer protection issue, when it was most of developing countries were not as affected by it. It was affected more. It affected developed countries more. The issues around the ozone layer, and so what we saw in practice was a stronger move from the global north countries because they were more affected. And so it made it easier for the global south countries to get some of what they needed. Unfortunately, the dynamics are not equivalent here. So the dynamics now are that the global south countries are more affected, and the global north countries they are affected, but not nearly as much, because in terms of adaptation, they have the resources. They can easily adapt if they need to. So you now have this situation where, like using my imperfect analogy, it's the younger brother that is now having a challenge, and it becomes more difficult to get that support. So the way I look at it is that, yes, it's not our fault, but because of we see the dynamics, it's hard for us to say we will not do something. It's hard for us to say we would just wait, because the dynamics do not favor a possibility where we would relax and everything, and the global north countries would take up certain responsibilities. It would be a joint effort in this case. That's my own reading of the situation. It would require a joint effort of all countries, regardless of the fact that we did not, African countries did not necessarily cause this problem, but the dynamics are such that expecting, everything would be hard. It's better to be practical and understand that we have to do our own bit, because we are the ones most affected. And if we don't do our own bit and try to, push this in the direction it should go, then we would still be the ones that will bear the brunt of it. So it's more a question of survival on the part of, global south countries. Is either you put in your own effort, or you suffer the consequences. And if we don't suffer the consequences, then we must work even when, the global north countries have not done what they need to do.
Thank you so much. That is actually a position I align with. So I'll take another question from Evelyn Miano. He said, you've explained the biggest issue to technology justice being lack of clear frameworks and clarity of obligations. So now, what stops or delays the development of proper obligations?
Okay. What so I know, yes, I did speak from a legal perspective. But most of what happens at COP, at Conference of Parties, is not legal. Most of what happens there is political. And political is about negotiating power. And if you don't have the strong negotiating power, you may not be able to get what you are hoping to get out of the transaction. Now, interestingly, some may think that, okay, maybe global south countries do not, push as they should, or they, just accept whatever happens. But, when they go for these conferences, first of all, they are looking for an outcome. They need something. We can't travel from all around the world and we do not get something. That's one. Two, when you look at the draft documents before the final version, what you would see is that there is a lot of there are some provisions there which, if they had been added into the final document, that would have settled the issue once and for all. But whenever these provisions are included, they face very strong resistance from the countries that would be affected. And so that's one of the challenges we have with the international climate regime. And we may be able to identify the injustices, we may be able to identify the problems, but because of the political undertone, behind how these international legal frameworks and obligations are framed, because of that undertone, it is hard for us to expect these countries to do all they need to do. It's hard. Developed countries have a way that during these negotiations they use the influence that they wield to prevent the final version from being a version that would harm their interests. And so we have that conversation around national self-interest. And we may have even, negotiating teams that go there may be strong negotiating teams, but those, you have the African group of negotiators, for example, does not necessarily mean it's still about political influence. How are you able to push, what do you have on the table? So let me go back, to the Montreal Protocol, and that's why I say it's more political. When you have leverage, you are able to negotiate. In the context of climate change, most global south countries do not have leverage. They don't have leverage because they are most affected by it. They don't have the resources to move. So there's no leverage there. In the Montreal Protocol, it, global south countries like China and India, they refused to join because they said that they needed support in terms of technology and finance. And because they were not as affected, they were able to get that. So it's also about that leverage. So at the international level, in terms of the agreements and the obligations, it's quite hard because of those political dynamics to get the agreement. And so what can we do? Because this is the agreement we have. We have to start thinking within those agreements, pending if there is another agreement or, there's a shift that makes it easier for, global south countries to negotiate. We have to find ways within these agreements to achieve more. We have to find ways within these agreements. So like we look towards the, how it is operationalized. We look towards interpretation, bringing out interpretations from what has already been agreed to and bringing out implementation that could align with or move us in the direction of what we want. But in terms of just the obligations themselves and negotiating them, that is a very different conversation. And that's why even in research, when we do our research, legal research, we don't necessarily come out to say we want to maybe change a particular international agreement because we understand the difficulty with even achieving consensus between, over 100, maybe about 190 countries or so. So instead of looking for new laws or a new framework, we instead call for better operationalization. We try to interpret it in the way that, we basically work with what we get. So it's like, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade kind of situation. So with the international climate regime, we do make lemonade, trying to get the best out of what we see there. And maybe if it ever happens that the dynamics shift, and then there's the negotiating power, it shifts in one direction. That is the only thing that could necessitate and give rise to an agreement that meets our needs. But I think I want us to just understand the difference between the political side of things and the legal side of things, and they don't always come together.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take more questions. So I'll move to the Q&A segment and take a few questions. So Ojochide says, are there any obligations on the international community to provide technology transfer? Are there any binding instruments? And if not, how does one draw the line of injustice, especially where there are no obligations?
Okay, that's a deep question. So are there any obligations to provide technology transfer? So let me start by saying that at the international level, obligations are not necessarily hard law obligations, particularly when we look at international environmental law, which is where, the climate regime falls under. We don't have hard law in that sense. We may have soft law, legal frameworks, which may provide what we call obligations of conduct. So, just to explain, we have obligations of conduct, which is that you have an obligation to make efforts towards achieving a goal. And then we have obligations of results, which are that you must meet these results. So within international environmental law, what we have more of are obligations of conduct. So the obligation is that you must take these efforts. And so we measure the move you are making towards taking these efforts, not that you must achieve this objective. So having said that, the obligations, and I use that word obligations not in the traditional sense we may understand it from a legal background, because of that soft law slant, the obligations I would say are quite diffuse because they are not as strong as they could be, even within the context of international environmental law. So there are obligations within international environmental law, and I keep going back to the Montreal Protocol. Its obligations on technology transfer were clearer and much stronger than what we have under the Paris Agreement. So even within that soft law regime, there's a variety of options where you say, okay, this is stronger and this is weaker. And what we have within the climate regime is actually weaker compared to some other regimes. And that's something, so it is there. But when we go into the details of it, there's significant lack of clarity. So sometimes it's not clear who has the responsibility to do something. Sometimes it's not clear what they are responsible for. And because these are obligations of conduct, many times there is no sanctioning body that would say you have not met up with your obligations and so you will be punished. Within different international legal regimes, they may have this, but it does not exist within international environmental law. So in terms of the binding instruments, they are not as strong as we would expect in traditional, legal systems. And I would still say that some legal systems, like maybe when you look at sometimes international trade law or international investment law, they may have stronger enforcement mechanisms, but that doesn't necessarily translate in international environmental law. And then you ask the question, okay, how do we draw, the line of injustice, especially where there are no obligations? So I think that's where the conversation on justice becomes more important and more relevant. Like I've said before, because of the political dynamics at play, the institutional, so people come together at a conference and they come into an agreement, but what they institutionalize typically falls short of what justice requires. So we must understand that difference between law and justice and realize that in many cases, especially at the international level and within international environmental law, what constitutes law doesn't necessarily equate justice. And so that is the reason why we have to continue pushing the conversation around justice, because the gap, that's where the gap is. The gap is that this system, as it has been structured, whether you are focusing on it from the perspective that the obligations are not strong enough or whichever perspective, it does not encourage or engender or embed justice. And so that's what makes the discussion around justice stronger. And so if we are advocating for this, we are advocating for a future where we have those stronger obligations, or we move towards something that is stronger, which is what will eventually provide us with the justice that we need. So the conversation doesn't cease. The conversation of justice only ceases where there is no, where the law itself has been created in a way that entrenches justice completely. But within international environmental law, there is significant space and gap for justice conversations because the operationalization, and adoption of those treaties and agreements do not equate to the institutionalization of justice.
Thank you so much. And I think, do you also think that, because remember, do you also think international law, international is more on the soft law side because,
Yes.
they also have to respect national sovereignty and other factors. But do you think, because I'm also thinking, there are so many angles to look at it, because when you look at like the EU framework, they put out directives, and then those directives are now transposed into domestic laws. So it's almost like giving you a pathway or guidance as to how, so that there is some form of standardization and unity across the different systems. Do you not think that is something international? Because there are two angles. So you have the EU framework, and then when you look at a completely different side of things, like maybe data protection, you have the international law respecting the member states' laws, because there are some data protection rules that particularly favor member state laws and defer to those laws. But then I'm trying to see, is there a way to balance that intricacy between creating standardized guidelines that member states can adopt while also respecting, because it's a tricky balance, and that's why people keep pushing for new international order. What should the international law look like? What framework should we adopt to ensure that it goes beyond obligatory or non-obligatory commitments, because these commitments are typically non-binding. So how do we move? Because if we don't, there'll be another COP that will come, and it will be the same, another
Yes.
more recommendations to come out of it. They'll probably put out an advisory opinion, the ICJ. Then what happens? When do we get to the point where, like you said, responsibility is now made obligatory as opposed to voluntary?
Okay. Thank you for the professorial question.
This is
So, so yes, Dr. Ibe, I agree with you. So, like you rightly said, within the EU framework, so when we look at the EU is a collection of, countries within the European continent that have come together and agreed to be as one, right? So they've come together and agreed to be as one, and they have, put those rules in play that say, okay, when we issue out a directive, then this directive will supersede your domestic laws or domestic legislation, if you have any, right, on that particular issue. Okay, okay. Yeah, so it will supersede. Okay, sorry. It will supersede, the domestic legislation. So when you have that kind of system, it's easier to get to the point where, there is standardization, and you now have, all the countries being, forced, in quotes, to abide by a directive that has been issued at a higher level. So looking at the EU operates as a sovereign country with many sovereign countries inside, So that is a very different conversation from the international level, where this is now not a regional. So the EU is more of the success of, a regional body in working together. At the international level, the level of or the extent of sovereignty, plays is too significant. There are certain countries, names withheld, that would never agree to, participate in an international legal regime where they have to be subjected to an agreement, by some, just, a collective of countries. Many countries would not accept democracy as a means of determining what they should or should not do. So that imagine where, all 150 countries, they agree to, something, and then the most powerful countries do not agree. It's not going to work. So I think that's where the challenge is.
I guess, yeah.
Yes, within the EU context, it's possible, and maybe that's a lesson, maybe for the African context, so as a continent, maybe maybe on specific issues, deciding that okay, maybe we can come together and tackle this issue as one, and so you also talked about the balance, like how do you now, balance it out with the state itself? How do we balance all of this out? It's a good way to look at it, like, okay, we shouldn't touch on all issues. We can touch on some issues. We can say, okay, or maybe on energy, let's come together, let's work together, let's see how we can have energy cooperation. We need to end this issue of energy, and that's all we are cooperating on. We are not going into defense, we are not going to other things. So maybe that's one way, that the African continent can do that, get into specific issues that they can agree upon and then work on them, uniformly. But at the international level, the differences are just too significant. The political interests are too divergent, and for anything that would end up being largely binding on these countries, they would not be quick to accept it.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll take the next one. From Deborah. To what extent do intellectual property rights over climate-related technologies create barriers to technology diffusion in developing countries? And how can international legal and policy frameworks under instruments such as the Paris Agreement be strengthened to ensure more equitable access and fair usage of such technologies?
Okay. Thank you. I think maybe for another cohort, I'll speak for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Anyway, that's besides the point. I'm really enjoying the questions. Thank you so much, Deborah, for the question. So, um, you asked, okay, what extent do IPRs create barriers? So this is a bit controversial because when we look at both sets of countries, developed versus developing, they have different perspectives. For developed, there are no barriers. For developing, there are barriers. Developed countries will say what we are doing is that it's not even our technology. Technology belongs to companies that make it. So that regime is there to protect them. The regime is not about us, but it just so happens that the people who benefit the most, from the international or intellectual property regime are firms based in developed countries. So for developing countries, it definitely comes as a barrier to an extent, but not completely. So let me give an example. One, in terms of costs, that which is what I've spoken about. Some of the costs associated with IPRs are very, very high, and it makes it very difficult for these countries to pay the patent and licensing costs that are associated with particular types of technologies. Also, the IPR regime calls on countries to make laws that protect the rights of investors or holders of IPRs within their territories. And if these rights are violated, then they can be subjected to, litigation and all of that, which would, sometimes, depending on the amount, could potentially cripple economies. If a particular technology type has been released to a country and the country violates the IPR, because that aspect of international law is quite binding compared to international environmental law, it would go, to a decision, and the decision could have significant financial implications for that country. So when you look at that kind of situation, you see how, sorry, I'm trying to find the question. You see how it can impact on developing countries. So developing countries are significantly impacted. They may not have another thing also is that the people who make this technology, so there are time limits when it comes to IPR, right? And they could make this technology, let's say 2010, right? So they've made the technology and they keep making updates to the technology so that you never get to a point where this technology is available for you to replicate. So they say, okay, oh, you're getting to the point where you can replicate, and then they make an update to it, and then you can't touch that as well. And they make another update and you can't touch that. And so in that process, you are kind of stuck in a loop where you cannot go beyond, you cannot, have the opportunity to replicate, because to do so would expose you to to challenges in terms of being, litigation or something like that. So that's what I would say. I was trying to look for, I don't know if that answers the
Okay.
question. Yeah, but I
Yes.
think there was a second part, but I can't really see the question
It
here.
says, how can international legal and policy frameworks under instruments such as the Paris Agreement be strengthened to ensure more equitable access and fair use of such technologies?
Okay. Well, the thing is that the international climate regime generally doesn't even want to mention anything to do with IPRs. And that is specific to this regime, to the Paris Agreement. There are other international agreements that touch on and discuss intellectual property rights. But for this agreement, it has, and we must look at things in the context that the international climate regime started sometime in 1992. And this is well over 30 years or so afterwards, and they still resist the inclusion of anything to do with IPRs. So in terms of the strengthening, if we are looking, that's why, even though we talked about it, if we are looking to the introduction of IPRs, it would take a while. It may not happen as automatically as we would expect it if we are looking for that. But we can try to, in terms of strengthening, we can try to operate within what currently exists. So we can look at the existing, what the Paris Agreement currently allows, and then see how we can achieve our goals. So for example, we have the technology mechanism where countries can make requests, to support in terms of technology needs assessment. So if a country makes a request and says, okay, we need support with preparing our technology needs assessment, which is done. And when that is done, and this is within the context of the climate regime, it's done. And then another country says, okay, we're going to fund that. The funding would typically or possibly include IPR costs. So without introducing the conversation around IPR costs, it can be done. So what we do when it comes to climate regime is not necessarily to call for, I think that's one of the things I miss about domestic legislation in terms of research. For domestic legislation, you just say that law is bad, we need to change it. For in the international regime, that is something, that's not a conversation you can easily have. Rather, let us see, based on what we have, how can we make things, how can we navigate this system that is explicitly designed to frustrate the inclusion of certain things. So that would be my response.
Thank you so much for that. So I'll move on to the next question. I think we have a few more. They said the framing, Samson says the framing of
Sorry,
the
whose
Samson,
question, please? Okay.
Samson, the framing of the Technology Transfer Pact Paris Agreement really lacks specificity. But what was the level of involvement of third world countries in the drafting phase? Their input and participation would have cured some of the gaps in the existing agreements.
Okay, thank you, Samson. I think that's a very astute observation, because it definitely lacks specificity, which is what I've been saying. Now, as to the involvement of the global South countries, I can't speak to that because I have not, I don't want to undermine them and say maybe they did not participate when they participated actively, but I will just give a sense of what I think. So just my thoughts would be that they did participate, but like I have mentioned earlier, the dynamics that are typically at play when it comes to negotiating provisions within the international climate regime are sometimes quite strong. And when it comes to technology transfer in particular, why there's always this resistance is that technology transfer somehow means that certain countries will lose their competitive edge, which is something that they are not keen on doing. And so watering down technology transfer provisions makes it less likely for these countries to be able to lose, less likely for them to lose their competitive advantage. They are able to have control over these technologies. And so when it comes to the negotiating, I do believe that we have, there are people there. Sometimes we could say that, okay, maybe it is a function of, okay, let me just say this other thing. Sometimes the focus of a particular COP is on one issue over the other. So sometimes at the COP, they say, okay, this year we are focusing on finance. And so all efforts are put towards maybe finance, but doesn't now mean that countries will now look into technology. One of the reasons why technology is not really a conversation is that it is always pushed to the back burner. Technology has never at any point in time that I know been an issue at the forefront. And that is quite shocking because it is the main issue. Like we've seen from the beginning, technological choices of the past brought us here. Technological choices of the present will take us towards a sustainable energy future. But if you look or if you are reading through maybe the decisions at the UNFCCC, you would notice that there is very limited information on technology compared to finance. So finance seems to be the big issue. And that's fine. That's okay. But let's now think, okay, because I talked about affordability issues, right? So even if the negotiators focus, okay, on affordability, perhaps what they can do is let's see how to link finance and technology more directly. That would help us to solve one injustice. And I think that's a way for us to think about it that, okay, now that we know these different injustices that we've touched on, if we find ourselves being part of negotiations or, working with teams that are going for these negotiations, knowing what to push for while understanding the political dynamics at play would be quite helpful. So yeah, I think I really agree with you on what you have said, your question, but that would be my approach to this.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to rush through because we are running out of time. Um, Samson again is asking whether while we know there are international agreements that recognize the need to reduce technology injustice, should these developing countries not refocus their budget to explore innovation in renewables and use legal instruments to achieve this? And how
Okay.
can it be practically approached?
Okay, so the first part of the question, whether they are international,
No, it's
um,
recognizing they are. It's just asking
okay,
if
recognizing they
developing
are.
countries should they not now refocus there, since we know how
Okay,
international agreements are non-binding, shouldn't they refocus their budget to explore innovation in technologies and use legal instruments to achieve
okay.
this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a lot of countries are already doing this, because when we discuss sustainable energy, we must always start from climate change because countries did not individually just agree and say, you know what, we have oil, crude oil that earns a lot of money for us, and we are going to make a law that promotes renewables. All of this started because of conversations around climate change. And so the energy transition, everything about it is based on climate change. Many countries have started to introduce laws, policies that, move in that direction of addressing climate change. So we have for the energy transition, we have a lot of energy transition plans in place in many different countries. We have, new legislation. Yeah, different countries, say in Africa, have set up climate legislation, climate acts. So we are seeing that movement, in terms of legislating for climate. Now, maybe specific to technology, the connection is not always made because the country's priority may align with the priority at the international level, which is climate finance. But climate finance, it's absolutely significant, but may not solve every single problem because if you have the finance without the capability or the ability to re-engineer technologies, then you're just going to spend all that money importing items instead of building capacity. So that only solves one aspect of the problem, but other aspects of the problem remain unaddressed.
Thank you. I think that answers Chinaya's question as well about how
Okay.
you can enact laws and policies. So I'll skip that. Deborah says, given the uncertainty around climate finance and support, how can developing countries make their NDCs more specific without risking overcommitment or under delivery?
Okay. So how can they make the NDCs more specific? Okay, so because the way that the NDC is structured, yeah, I understand, is that you have to make more ambitious commitments. So you are trying to move, to a higher level in terms of your commitments, and you don't want to overcommit. That's why we have the teams, in place who work with, them. The developed countries also support them in preparing the NDC, so they know, where to put their efforts and all of that. The thing is that all countries have obligations, so they have to think about how they are going to meet those obligations. And for me, this question is very important because sometimes you have countries that when you look at their NDCs, you know that they are not going to achieve them. And so that's a fundamental flaw with the system because yes, you speak to maybe not overcommitting. Many countries have overcommitted, and there's that's the weakness of the climate regime. There's no punishment there's nothing that is going to happen to these countries, whether they overcommit or not. The climate regime is basically saying, okay, all countries, say what you do in the next 5 years, increase it, in the next 5 years, increase it. And when we check everything, we will look at what all the countries have done and say, we have not reached our goal, please increase it. They could even check the level of implementation and they won't say, oh, country A, you have not done what you're supposed to do. They just say, no, okay, we all have not done what we are supposed to do. Let's increase our efforts. And that's the best that the climate regime can do. The implementation committee is called the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, PAICC. It's facilitative in nature, it's non-punitive, so it cannot take any measures whatsoever based on the way it is structured. So it's now makes it one wonder that, okay, this regime that has been created, how do we prevent countries from overcommitting? For many countries, it's just let's commit and, they get off our backs for the next 5 years and we will try. But let me also say this, that because the climate regime doesn't call for obligations of results, but obligations of conduct. As long as a country shows that they are working towards it, they would be fine. There are many countries that have actually, maybe under different regimes, that they work towards it, and where they don't work towards it, because there is a stronger enforcement mechanism under those, Montreal Protocol, at least they would call out the country and say, this country has been issued a notice of non-compliance for not meeting up, but that doesn't exist within the international climate regime. So I wouldn't worry as much about overcommitting and that's just my honest view, because there is where there's really nothing much that can be done. The regime does not have the teeth to do anything. I know of a certain country, name withheld, that has promised to meet the 30,000 or so megawatts, and I really don't see that happening. So within the short time that they've planned to. So I think those are issues that we see, and I think that's where the problem within that regime is.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's usually like a New Year resolution.
Exactly.
You just put it out there and then stock take at the end of the year,
Exactly.
and then put another one the next year. But I
Exactly.
think that is why there needs to be more firm, obligatory, initiatives or instruments, which then allows for countries to be more committed to meeting these NDCs and the other targets. Um,
Okay.
so I will take the IP question. I'll try to take them all at once because they're sort of all related.
Okay.
Sananu is asking, to what extent should IP rights be limited or reformed to improve access to climate technologies for developing countries without discouraging innovation? So should the IP rights be, to what extent can they be limited or reformed? And even if they are, so the protection of IP rights, do they risk creating technology injustices, or is it a trade-off for innovation in addressing climate change? So to what extent should the IP rights be limited or reformed to improve access to climate technologies, and do these rights in themselves create technology injustices, or are there necessary trade-offs to address climate change?
Okay. I think so. The thing with the IPR regime is that it promotes innovation, but it's a regime that is primarily designed for the firms, and mostly global north firms, to protect their interests. It's not about countries, really. It's about protecting the interest of firms. So IPR promotes innovation, and sometimes IPR may may appear to be a problem, But I think for me, I think we should just look at it from the perspective that, okay, this regime is it exists alongside a lot of different regimes. So the IPR regime was not created for addressing climate change, and it wasn't created for securing an energy transition. It was created for a totally different purpose. And that regime has been able to function even, let's say, under some other different international regimes. It has functioned alongside, like under the Montreal Protocol. But what I would say is that within the climate regime, one of the best measures that can be taken is that the climate regime we should look at the existing obligations under the climate regime and how we can tailor them to addressing issues relating to IPR. We may not be able to address all the issues, but we can address some. The main thing and the main obligation that can help us with this is that obligation of finance under Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which talks about developed countries providing finance. Because if they do provide that finance, then that gives or creates more opportunity for developing countries to be able to finance some of the costs. Now, there may be other issues that arise with IPR, but within the context of the climate regime, that may just be our best bet, because, like I said, there has been resistance over 30 years of even mentioning IPR within the context of the climate regime. And so if we must move forward, we have to consider what we have in terms of the regime itself, and then see how we can find solutions to some of the problems that IPRs may cause. So some countries may decide to strengthen their IPR regimes to attract, and then may enter into different kinds of agreements to facilitate this. But I think that it would be very difficult to expect a reformation of the IPR regime itself. And so the climate regime may be forced to align or, find a way to work around the difficulties that that regime poses.
Thank you so much. I think we have sort of taken all the questions, and we only have 5 minutes to the end of this session. So thank you all. I hope the session was as insightful to you as it was to me. Thank you, Dr. Mark, for bringing this area into a clearer perspective. We've gained a lot of insights, and the slides will be made available after the
Okay.
session. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next session holding on Monday, the 13th of April. Thank you all. And Dr. Mark, thank you so much. We'll continue to call on your expertise at the
Okay,
academy.
no
And
worries.
thank you for making yourself available.
I'm happy to make myself available. I think the only other thing I wanted to say,
Okay.
if allowed to, is just that for
Yes.
that scenario that I sent, it's the number 2 and 6 that wouldn't really constitute injustices, and the
Mm.
rest would constitute injustices based on the lesson we've had so far. But thank you all so much, for participating and for contributing, and with your questions. I think we have been able to arrive at something really unique, discussing an area that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But I think we can all take something, out of this whole process, and maybe have other conversations that we can touch on. I think this is an area that people need to really, look into more, talk about more. And I really, and Dr. Ivy, I really appreciate the opportunity as always. Thank you so much for
Thank you
having.
so much. Please feel free
Yes,
to connect with Dr. Mark on LinkedIn and
yes,
connect
yes,
with me and all the other facilitators. Will be more than happy to continue to
exactly,
engage.
exactly.
Thank you all so much, and
Thank you all
enjoy
so
the
much.
rest of your day.